without further ado, the first question I have is just kind of an introductory question to ask each of our panelists, what do you do at your institution? And what's your connection to welcoming work? And I'm going to start off directing that question to Daniel.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Michael, for having us today and for this conversation. So I'm Daniel Valdez, he, him pronouns. I'm the Senior Director of External Affairs at Welcoming America. In this role, I oversee our development work, our communications and marketing work, as well as our strategic partnership. And our role at Welcoming America, we are a national nonprofit organization that leads a movement of inclusive communities that are looking to become more prosperous by ensuring everyone belongs. And we do this through a number of different programs. Core to that is our Welcoming Network. Currently, we have over 330 members of our network. That includes local governments, city and county governments, as well as nonprofit organizations that are working to help their communities be more welcoming and inclusive for newcomers. And so we support our members and our partners in this work, and we help them develop the roadmap that they need to create welcoming policies and share new approaches to inclusion to create an environment where everyone can truly thrive. So that's a little bit about Welcoming America and my role there.
Thanks so much, Daniel. Appreciate that. Christine, can you do the same for us?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me today, along with these great colleagues. So I lead community engagement and communications at the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center, also known as MERC. We are a statewide legal resource center for low-income immigrant communities, and we work to build a thriving Michigan where immigrants experience equity and belonging. We focus on three key areas: legal services, systemic advocacy, and community engagement and education. So we provide free immigration legal services. We serve victims of crime, farm workers, immigrant workers, folks applying for asylum and naturalization. We do full intakes and provide legal advice to everyone detained by Immigration, Customs, and Enforcement in Michigan. And then we also provide legal services for all unaccompanied children in federal custody in Michigan. Through our systemic advocacy, we collaborate with partners through several coalitions and advocate for federal, state, and local policies that would support immigrants, as well as take on certain immigrant rights impact litigation. And then through our media and communications, we also try to change the narrative around immigration in Michigan, as well as provide technical assistance and training and education to a wide variety of stakeholders. MERC is a Welcoming America member, and I was previously the Welcoming Michigan director and one of the original Welcoming America members. So I've been involved with the welcoming movement since about 2011. So happy to say I've seen it grow and develop over the years, especially here in Michigan.
Christine, thanks so much. And I just want to say, as someone who's lived mainly on the coast of this country and for a long time in Mexico City, it really struck me when I moved to Michigan 2 years ago how many refugees and migrants the state takes in, and what central importance welcoming work has in the state, and the valuable contribution that you make at the center. So thanks very much for that. And Surabhi wins the prize for the best background, enjoying a lovely Michigan summer day, it looks like. So Surabhi, tell us about your work at the Community Foundation for Southeast Michigan.
Sure, thanks for having me here. So my name is Surabhi Pandit. I'm the Director of Human Services Initiatives at the Community Foundation for Southeast Michigan. We are a Detroit-based foundation that serves 7 counties of the state. And my work, so part of my human services work, a big part has been in the last few years has been immigrant and refugee support. So I was a part of the lead for encouraging funders to come together and create the Southeast Michigan Immigrant and Refugee Funders Collaborative. And through that work, we've supported, and kind of outside of it, also supported welcoming initiatives and organizations who are working towards that.
Thanks so much. And just to give a shout out to my dear friends in the Community Foundation world, it used to be the case, going back decades, that people viewed community foundations as sort of philanthropic banks that mainly were aimed at servicing donors. And increasingly, I think one of the most important changes that's happened in the United States is community foundations embracing the role of being community leaders. Thanks to organizations like CF Leads, for example, this idea that community foundations ought to be engaging, thinking about the directions their communities are taking, and embracing things like inclusion and advocacy on behalf of migrants and new Americans. And I think Surabhi's work in collaboration with Christine really demonstrates the value of that kind of stance and posture on the part of community foundations. And for me, is a real welcome development in the community philanthropy world. The other thing I'll mention before we get to our second question is Larry has written out his comments, and we'll be sharing those written comments after the fact through that email that I mentioned before, follow-up email. So I want to recognize in our second question that this is complex work. It's not easy. There's a lot of moving parts, a lot of people to engage with. So I'd like for each of our panelists to talk about how you understand the challenge of inclusion in your work and where you're seeing movement. What type of progress are you seeing, are you seeking as you move forward? And I'll start this time with Christine.
Thanks. Yeah, big question. So as an organization, we have certainly found, that you really just can't do this work without centering race, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, and this is true whether you're working in a majority white community or a majority Latinx community, whether it's a rural, suburban, or urban setting, and really regardless of whether your work is more external or internal facing. So we've committed to advancing inclusion and racial equity, both internally and externally. Internally, we've done some work, to, affirm our values and ongoing commitment to anti-racism. And we have a statement that I'll post in the chat. We started a DEI committee and launched employee race caucus groups. And we really try to bring a DEI lens to really everything we do, from deciding the art that goes on the wall in the office to improving our hiring and staff retention practices. We're currently working on a race equity tool that walks staff through certain considerations when they're making decisions. So for example, what does the community think about the issue? What is the history of the issue? What does the data say? And what's the narrative around that issue? But there's always more work that we can do to ensure equity and inclusion. So training is really critical, on especially ongoing training for both our community partners as well as our staff. So we have an internal team that's always looking at, the next training topic that we might need. And we've arranged presentations, about LGBTQ+ communities, partnered with the disability community and anti-racist trainers. Externally, we really try to prioritize our resources for low-income communities of color that are most impacted, and really work to uplift the advocacy efforts that are led by immigrants and immigrant-led groups. We advocate with policymakers, agencies and municipalities to ensure that immigrants of all statuses are included in their policies and programs. And in our community engagement work, we look at, for example, all the groups that we work with and really drill down to see who's missing, and then make sure we're doing the specific outreach to that community to build those relationships and make sure we're staying in connection. And then in terms of progress, I can say that we've seen more agencies and municipalities get involved around issues of immigration and intentionally adopt more inclusive policies and practices. We've seen entities sometimes respond, to organized pressure from community advocates, but we've also seen agencies who are open to learning and receiving feedback. So, for example, recently after a meeting with the Detroit Water Department, they're now updating the criteria to open a water account to make sure that it's inclusive of immigrants without status. I also serve as co-chair for the Detroit Immigration Task Force. And so I get to work closely with the city of Detroit in particular on their efforts to be more inclusive. But I've also partnered with lots of other municipalities who are interested in getting involved. And really, there's so many ways for communities to get started. And it really all boils down to inclusion. So you can start looking at what you're already doing and consider, okay, how can I bring that lens of equity and inclusion to it, and make those adjustments? And then after that, you can start to look at, okay, what are we not doing? What might we need to start doing? And then what are the specific programs or initiatives that would help you close the gaps or address the unmet needs? And again, all with that lens of equity and inclusion. So that's a little bit of how we're approaching that question.
Thanks so much, Christina. And I think it's important to underline that idea that it's not just looking out to the world and demanding change from government. It's also the internal work that each organization faces that we work with here, and the Johnson Center, as you shared at the Immigrant Rights Center as well. Surabhi, I'd like to direct that same question to you about how you understand the challenge of inclusion and where you might be seeing movement, progress, where you're looking to make it.
Sure. So I think this is a pretty layered question, and I can answer from a couple of perspectives of both. And Christine did a great job of that too, of the internal work, and then what does that mean looking outwards? And for me, I think one of the biggest aspects of like really meaningfully thinking about equity inclusion is thinking about mindset shift, right? So Michael, you kind of talked about community foundations didn't historically show up in certain spaces in the past and how we're kind of moving in that direction. And so when we're doing that, are we moving at the right pace to be inclusive, right? So a lot of our grant programs and like where I work, or even just in general, community foundations period, have a lot of barriers to entry. And so there, we have, you have to have an audit, you have to have this, you have to have that. And a lot of times it just leaves so many of the grassroots groups out. It's just, to me, it's yes, we need to do better about who we fund and how we fund, but it's also who aren't we reaching? And I think that's kind of a central question to thinking about inclusion. So I am happy to see, when we are in spaces that we traditionally weren't in, like this, our Immigrant Refugee Funder Collaborative. I don't know if 20 years ago we would have been a leader for this work. I mean, I'm not sure that we would have been positioned that way, nor was the perception of us or community foundations the same as it is now, right? And I think that's good. That changes, like we're moving in a good direction, that people see us as a partner in that way. Another part of the inclusion work that I think is really important is funder humility. I think that a lot of times foundations can show up in the room, obviously with the privilege of having resources and funding, with particular hopes and where we want to go. And I think we just have to take a step back from that to say, like, if we really want to be truly inclusive and embrace DEI lens on all of our work, we have to ensure that people who are closest to the issue are at the table as well. And a lot of times thinking about inclusion means that you have to be willing to give up something. And I don't know that that's hard, right? It is hard when we work in institutions and organized philanthropy. It is hard to give up a thing, to give up the way you do your work, change the way you do it. A lot of it, I think, too, is, that age old, like we've always done it this way. How could we possibly think about it another way? And I think to really advance the work of inclusion and what it means to each community means, like, how are we being reflective? Like, what is that? I think Christine did a great job of talking about the introspective part of it. So we, as a foundation right now, we are undergoing a strategic plan. I'm supporting more of the DEI work moving forward, and hopefully thinking about how we don't just have one policy that sits in the corner that we look at every once in a while, but how do we meaningfully integrate these principles throughout all of our work.
Thanks so much, Surabhi. As always, such thoughtful comments. And that as I hear you speak, when we talk about inclusion, it's not just having a few more chairs at a table. It's actually giving people the opportunity not only to speak, but to be involved in decision making. And that's probably the hardest part of this sort of work, is when you get into the power dynamics of how issues are prioritized, how they're funded. And this, for me, important and valuable movement in the field towards trust-based philanthropy and thinking about more community-centric styles of giving. And I think that it just all is of a piece. But enough from me. Daniel, if you could share your thoughts on the challenge of inclusion and what sort of progress you might be seeing from where you sit.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Welcoming America began out of work that was happening in the South that was really challenging these newcomers and creating barriers for our immigrant and refugee communities in places that were experiencing demographic change. So our work is really centered on DEI, but also adding that a belonging piece to it as well. And so we think that that diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging are fundamental elements of building welcoming societies for all. And that our approach is rooted in understanding that there are factors impeding the success for immigrants and non-immigrants alike that are often rooted in a legacy of colonialism, structural racism, interpersonal biases that we must overcome in order to really achieve our vision of an inclusive society in which people can thrive. And our purpose is really to enable belonging for everyone, and explicitly immigrants in our work that we do at Welcoming America, and really being able to recognize that belonging is a shared human need for everyone, but it can be expressed in ways that both hinder or advance a healthy multiracial democracy. And we need to be able to work on making sure that we're really utilizing that to advance this work. And we're really committed to this work, both internally, but certainly externally with our members in helping us think through program design and making sure that that we're helping leaders on the ground who are leading this work understand the importance of embedding things like racial equity into their work, thinking about climate justice work, of thinking about indigenous communities, really being able to bring all of those pieces together when we think about welcoming work. It needs to be also thought of as how can we make sure that that these welcoming policies that are to support the inclusion of immigrants and newcomers and refugees into our community can also be places where can help advance communities, other communities in local places across the country. So that's really how we see our DEIB framework and how we've sort of worked through that as well. Some of the challenges, as many I'm sure here are aware, around the narrative around immigrants and newcomers, and that narrative that a lot of times is very xenophobic, and how do we change that? How are we combating that kind of narrative? The lack of awareness around immigration laws, policies, gaps in critical infrastructure support that is needed to really help include these members of our communities into our civic and cultural and economic fabric of our local communities. But at the same time, we know that migration is a global issue. It's a global topic, and we're seeing a lot of communities stepping up, from nonprofit organizations to philanthropic sector, certainly local governments, and we're learning from one another. And I think not just here in the United States, but around the world. And I think that is, we're seeing this interest in the intersections, the continued intersections between immigrant inclusion work and racial justice work and other kinds of equity work around the world. So I think it's important for us to continue to find those intersections and to ensure that when we're also talking about equity as a term, that immigrant justice or immigrant inclusion work is part of that equation when we think about the broader equity word and how we're structuring that in our organizations and within the work that we do.
Daniel, thank you. And since you opened the door to this, I'm going to pursue a follow-up question with you now about the international implications and connections. Have you started to work across borders and connecting with nations outside of the United States?
Absolutely. So we have a Welcoming International program at Welcoming America, and we work with countries or national organizations, or national governments who are working on this, who have made this a priority as well. And those partnerships have allowed us to exchange ideas and best practices. When we think about our standard, for example, the welcoming standard that we've utilized as a map for local communities, there are other countries who are doing similar types of standards with their local governments, with their local communities. They're thinking about ways to create programming that really support this work. And we know that this is a topic that's impacting folks all over the world. And particularly when we think about the forced displacements of people when it comes to things like wars, as well as climate displacement. And all of these are areas in which there's a lot of energy and interest. And we are bringing together folks in Australia, in Germany, in the UK, in Spain, New Zealand, in Mexico, and others to really start thinking about this. And we are internationalizing our Welcoming Week event, which we'll talk a little bit more about, but that is certainly an opportunity for us to think about how are we talking about this work from an international perspective and bringing in as many actors, groups, and organizations and individuals into this work as possible.
Thanks so much. I appreciate that, Daniel. And I imagine you'll have some folks from Mexico in particular that they'll want to be connecting with you along these issues. And just a couple notes at the end of the presentation, we will be sharing emails of our various panelists. And so there'll be, and we're dropping in the chat some resources as we go along, like for example, Welcoming Week, which is coming right up in September. So we'll be talking about that in a moment. In light of the time, and our aim was to kind of shift to more Q&A around the top of the hour. So I'm going to move ahead and ask our panelists to shift gears and move from thinking about welcoming work into thinking about the SDGs and what they've meant in framing and helping the, as Larry laid out, that kind of measurable and meaningful impact. So this is, as I mentioned, our fourth workshop. We had one in Spanish to kick things off, speaking of inclusion and welcoming, and we've had two in English with the authors of that TFR special issue and a dear friend from the Central Florida Foundation in Orlando, Sandy Vidal, to talk about their work. And the central thread has been the SDGs and how they're useful in work of community foundations. So for this case, I'd like you all to reflect and share a little bit about the connection of welcoming work to the SDGs and how these frameworks help us to measure progress. Your engagement with the SDGs, how you see that connected to inclusion work, and how it helps you in terms of measuring progress. And I'd like to start with Christine, if we could.
Yeah, sure. So, well, we haven't organized our work directly around the SDGs per se. Looking at them, much of our efforts do map onto them. So, for example, our work to ensure school districts are welcoming regardless of immigration status and enrollment procedures, our representation of immigrant workers and ensuring safe workplaces, advocacy to ensure immigrants of all status can access water and have a water account. So they do overlap. And then I have more experience working with the welcoming standard and seeing how that plays out. And municipalities are, working to meet those inclusion requirements that are outlined there. And I've seen that be a really helpful organizing tool, both for the municipalities and the community partners alike. It helps like the SDGs, it helps provide a way to organize our work around some core areas. We have a common language, and those aspects that are included there have a truly meaningful impact on the lives of immigrants. So for example, at the welcoming standard, you have things, like preventing municipal policies that discriminate against immigrants, supporting immigrant workers, supporting civic engagement. So there's a lot that overlaps between the two, and that's how our work intersects with it.
Great. Thank you, Christine. Daniel, do you want to jump in here with some examples of how you make the connections in Welcoming America between the SDGs and the Welcoming Standard?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll talk a little bit about the welcoming standard just so that folks who are not, who don't know a lot about that. The welcoming standard is something that captures the core of what it means to be an inclusive and welcoming community. And this was developed in collaboration with local governments, advocates, and diverse experts, and with input from the public at large. And the standard really provides a comprehensive roadmap for communities working in the United States to become more inclusive to immigrants and refugees. And so the welcoming standard covers 7 categories critical to building a welcoming community. Government and community leadership is 1, civic engagement, equitable access, education, connected communities, economic development, and safe communities. And so under these areas, the welcoming standard establishes a benchmark to really help local leaders identify where and how their welcoming efforts could be furthered and to assess their progress in building a sustainable and sustaining a welcoming community. And so what we've done, and we're going to be developing a white paper that's going to talk a little bit about our work with community foundations, and it's going to include a mapping of our welcoming standards to the Sustainable Development Goals. And so all 7 framework areas of the welcoming standards have alignment with at least one of the SDGs, and the welcoming standard is most aligned with goals 10 on reducing inequality, goal 11 on sustainable cities and communities, and goal 16 on peace, justice, and strong institutions. And so I'm not going to go through all of the different areas, but I think Christine mentioned some of those, right? Ensuring that local government departments disseminate information on government services and resources and public benefits with the goal of expanding access to immigrants, around education, making sure that immigrant families receive language accessible information about services available through the local K through 12 school districts, along with information on their educational rights. Thinking about safe communities, for example, making sure that local law enforcement staff receive training on working with diverse residents, including immigrants. And so these are some of the things that are included within the standard that we can see in alignment with the Sustainable Development Goals. And so as organizations here in the United States are thinking about utilizing the SDGs, we hope that this tool can really help them understand how this connects very specifically to newcomer and immigrant communities in the United States, and mapping it out to the standard itself. So that's really how we're sort of thinking about it and utilizing it as a way to help those community foundations or other institutions that are utilizing the SDGs as a framework for their work, to give them this kind of a mapping tool that allows them to see those connections come to life and be very clear and direct in terms of how that shows up in the SDGs.
Daniel, thanks very much. And it really strikes me when we think about what inclusion means and belonging, an even stronger sense of that, the nuts and bolts of how we need to transform communities to make them truly welcoming, to transform them into a sense of belonging. It's so important to have coalitions that people collaborating across institutions between the public sector, the philanthropic sector, and the private sector to make that work happen. And so I'm going to jump ahead again a little bit, and I'd like to start to transition now to our Q&A. But Surabhi, I'd like you to kick it off by, if you want to add anything in terms of the SDGs and the welcoming standard, but start to dig into this question of collaboration. You and Christine have started to work together in your lovely part of the state of Michigan. And so if you can start to elaborate on what collaboration means to you, how the SDGs and the welcoming standards help you to have more fruitful collaboration, I think that'd be really helpful and of interest.
Sure. So I'll just, from a big picture perspective of collaboration. So I think the unique positioning of a community foundation is you are inevitably a collaborator, and you are working with a wide range of diverse stakeholders. And the more we position ourselves to sit in that collaborator and convener space, I think the better it is for everyone around us, and ourselves included. So when we started this funder collaborative, I think what's interesting, and in our prep call, we were talking about this, and I'm like, I should probably share some of the background of this, is that as important as it is to bring, to have X number of funders, putting together money to have meaningful impact in a specific area, in our case, to support immigrant and refugee serving nonprofits, there are a lot of funders who are not in the collaborative, but that we still talk to regularly. And I think that, when you talk about sector collaboration and you kind of wonder, okay, who's at the table, but who's not, I know we all do that, right? We look at a list and we say, oh, these are the people that are doing this. Why isn't so-and-so doing it? And why isn't that foundation in? But there's a lot of funder engagement that happens behind the scenes. And there are some people who I've, been courting for years and who haven't necessarily put funds into the collaborative, but have said, hey, send me your grants list when you make it, send me the RFP when it's out. And the request has been, even if you're not able to commit money into a pooled fund, could you align whatever it is you are doing with our overall vision and strategy? So at least whatever we're doing in the community is somehow connected, and it's not this disparate set of grants here and there. So I think there's the collaborative aspect that people see that is more transparent and public, but there is a lot of the behind the scenes collaboration of just helping inform each other about what's happening in the community and how do we foster collaboration that may not be as formal. And so I think another aspect of promoting collaboration, so I'll offer this through our first round of grant making. And I think one thing that I appreciate about even just starting this effort is the transparency of how much money we had to work with initially. Like, there wasn't a lot of it, right? It was a couple $100,000 that any one of our partners could have used that totally and still had, need and could have done such great things with it. But what we did was, instead of we didn't really want a competitive, like super competitive grant process. Like, you don't want to cast a huge net and get 1,000 applications and say, oh, we can only fund 2 people. And so we requested applicants to come in a like whatever collaboratives you were already doing. So something informal or something formal, it didn't matter to what level you had established the collaboration. And it was work that you were already doing, nothing new that you had to start. So we just wanted to fund existing work. And that's something that we learned a lot of. Funders always want to see new shiny projects. What about the work we do every day? Well, we want to fund that, right? So I think that's the other aspect of like promoting and funding collaboration, is that people are already doing it. It's not like a new thing, new concept among nonprofits, and that we should be positioning ourselves to fund existing collaborative work as well. I hope I got to your questions, Michael.
It's a very interesting reflection about how the sort of formal public-facing collaboration leads to greater communication and coordination among funders, and how that in turn, it's almost like you pick up that germ of working together, and then when you look to possible grantees, you say, hey, we want you guys to work together as well. We want to recognize what you're doing in an ongoing way, and to support and encourage that collaboration among our grantees as well. So it's almost infectious, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, and I would say too, we're also very careful to say collaboration when it makes sense, like not just because we want to see something happen, but for a lot of the people that we, all of the grants that we made the first round were people who said, yeah, we've been meeting together informally once a month. All of the blank service providers, are together doing this thing. We set a table and we said it can range from anything. I think that's the other thing about flexibility. Like, if you're convening people every month anyway, and you just need funds to like pay for a lunch or rent a room or do something, like that shouldn't matter to us as funders, right? Like, whatever it is that is needed and the organizations are prioritizing is what we should be funding. And so I think just having as loose guidelines as possible to say whatever it is you need, but just to support the fact that you are being collaborative, and that's obviously beneficial to the organizations and to the communities that we serve.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Surabhi. And Christine, I just to anticipate, I want to wrap up this last kind of formal question with Christine and put Larry on notice that one of the themes that he and I have talked about quite a bit is this idea that the SDGs are useful in a sense when they're useful. From our first webinar, our colleague Marta Ray Garcia from Spain used the phrase, use the SDGs, tiene sentido si tiene sentido. It makes sense to use them if it makes sense, which I loved, and that phrase has stayed with me through this summer. But first, Christine, if you could react a little bit from the grantee side to what Surabhi was talking about. And Larry, I'd like to get your kind of closing reflections on this discussion as we open up to the Q&A part of our session today.
Yeah, as a grantee, I'll just say we have especially appreciated the partnership of Surabhi and her team at the Community Foundation. They, for example, they were so responsive when we needed support quickly to serve Afghans applying for asylum. And she found out who was providing these services and worked quickly to get resources in such a seamless way. And we really appreciated the work she did to organize the Detroit Immigration Funder Collaborative that she mentioned. For so long, community organizations were approaching funders and kept saying immigration is so complex and we're still considering how we'll get involved. And it was, the leadership of the Community Foundation that really helped catalyze that. And, in the meantime, the community organization side, we had been going to funders saying, that the needs are urgent and the opportunity is now. So that leadership to form the collaborative and bring folks together was really appreciated. And I think it helped donors and funders see how, even if it was a small amount they were contributing, it could have an impact in this issue where, it does seem to many people that large amounts of resources are needed to make an impact. So by bringing folks together, it was really helpful to increase that collaboration. And then among the grantees as well. And just to kind of bring it full circle, I'll say, many of the grantees work together, for example, through the Detroit Immigration Task Force. And through that body, we work with the city and help advocate for the policies and practices that then help the city meet their welcoming standards and then achieve certification. So really, it really took all of us kind of collaborating truly across sectors here to make that happen. So I'll pass it to Larry to answer your other question, Michael.
Well, thank you. I think that, the first thing that occurs to me is that it takes a well-functioning ecosystem in order to create impact, sustainable impact. And collaboration is kind of a necessary but not sufficient piece of that. The sufficiency, I think, arises through the nature of the collaboration, whether it's a smart collaboration, a meaningful collaboration, whether it's right-sized, as Surabhi has reminded us, for example. And on top of that, as long as we have some elements of a common language with which to talk about the work that we're doing together, I think we're good to go. That is to say that in the case of the topic that we're focused on today, which is immigrant integration, for example, let's talk about the work from the perspective of the welcoming standard and the way that it outlines the steps, the very concrete steps that you can take to create places that are sustainably welcoming. We don't have to refer to the SDGs at all, which goes to Marta's comment. I think, use them if they're useful, or, there's probably a bad paraphrase, but I have repeatedly used the notion of the Trojan horse. nobody really needs to know that they're working on the SDGs as long as they're working in an aligned way with the SDGs. And the work that we're doing, in the Advancing Welcoming Project is meant to make sure that there are ways to be comfortable that you're contributing to the SDGs by working within a framework that makes sense on a local issue, on a particular issue. And we've tried to do that in a number of instances and are working closely with some other community foundations, for example, on trying to create ways to work on equity and inclusion that don't necessarily talk a whole lot about the SDGs per se, but that actually focus on how you might make sure that you're doing work that aligns with the SDGs by looking at the specific indicators in the SDG framework that can help point you in the direction of doing inclusive work and measuring progress on that work. So I'm really glad that we've kind of landed on the concept of collaboration here, and also on the concept of translation, if I could put it that way, or alignment between systems that make sense when you're doing work on the ground on a particular issue and the larger framework. There just needs to be some focus on the back end by someone to make sure that there's alignment, between the on the ground work and the sustainable goals.
Thanks so much, Larry. Just a request to our audience members. If you have a question, please feel encouraged to write it in the chat. If you want to ask a question, if you can raise your hand using that function. Otherwise, I'd like to hear some reflections from Daniel about how, given that you work closely with Larry, making that translation, the connection between the welcoming standard and the SDGs, how have you seen a value added for thinking about how the SDGs relate to the welcoming standard and the work that you're having, the conversations you're having with community foundations right now?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think for us, what you mentioned earlier, right, that not every institution or organization is using the SDGs, particularly here in the United States. We're seeing in other places around the world where that's probably something that they're more used to. So I think for us is how are we making sure that that if this is not something that community foundations are using or framing, that we're still talking to them about how this is lining up to our welcoming standard and that it's in line with these UN goals that were developed, these sustainable goals. And I think that for us, what's most important is how can we help local communities achieve their goal, which is to be more inclusive and welcoming and really unlock the potential that that these programs and policies can have for the well-being of the entire community. And we're looking forward to helping understand a little bit more about how the SDGs has or hasn't been useful to community foundations in a way that can let us understand what are the kinds of things that we need to do in order to move some of this forward and continue to support the work in these local communities. And I think in terms of what we've been learning with community foundations too, is just really understanding what are some of the needs and challenges and barriers to doing this work. And similar to our network of 300 plus members, they range from small rural communities to large urban areas, and there are in lots of different places all over the country, and the needs that they have and the challenges that they're seeing vary. And so how are we able to create a framework that allows folks to sort of work within that framework and at the same time meet people where they are in their process of doing this welcoming work? And that's something that I think the standard and the SDGs have been helpful for folks, is knowing that that all of this work doesn't happen overnight, and that there are a lot of different people that are involved in making this happen. And it's not just up to one institution to make this happen in their local communities, but it is really about a multi-sector collaborative and really bringing in as broad of a coalition to help address all of these different issues and bring in those lenses, those voices, and those intersections that are needed for for that long-term inclusion work that's going to be needed.
Thanks so much, Daniel. And I really appreciate the diversity of communities in which Welcoming America is operating. As you look at the map and where you see welcoming cities, it is across the country. And it's not just in the big cities, it's in the towns and across the board. And I really admire that as part of your work. I want to turn our attention to a couple questions and start with Christine to direct them. My friend Alma Cota, mi amiga from Sonora, asked the question about whether the Immigrant Rights Center works with refugees or migrants, asylum seekers. Is there any particular criteria? And I think a related question, and I don't know if I'm going to pronounce your name right, Cassien Cadeau. I'm tempted to try to speak French in saying it, but what if refugees don't really have much of a community? And we heard in our first webinar in Spanish, the experience of the city of Tijuana on the U.S.-Mexico border, the asylum seekers who might be from Haiti, they might be from Central America, they might be in Tijuana for a matter of months or weeks or maybe a year without being rooted, without having a sense of community. How do you start to address that crisis in how human beings move and lose that sense of community? I know that's a daunting question. So Christine, if you could start with that specific question for you, and I'll invite any or all of our other panelists to talk about that larger challenge as well.
Yeah, sure. So to the first question for Merck's client base, we serve low-income immigrants as long as they're in Michigan of all statuses. Actually, we're one of the few organizations that takes detained cases because it takes a lot of resources to serve those folks. So folks who are in detention, facing deportation, because a lot of the places they're detained are very far from where some of the attorneys are based. And so we travel all over the state to those locations and take those cases on. And we also have a help desk at the immigration court in Detroit. So anyone who's going there for a case and doesn't have representation, we try to meet with them, provide resources, and take as many of those cases as we can with our limited capacity and refer out to other organizations for if we can't. But folks of all statuses, and same for our advocacy work, we advocate for immigrants of all statuses. And to the second question, that comes up a lot in Michigan because, there's certain communities that are known to have a large established presence here. So for example, when we were receiving a lot of Syrian refugees, there's a Syrian community here. We had a much smaller Afghan community. So when more Afghans were coming to Michigan, that took some work to kind of make those connections and help those newcomers connect to the smaller Afghan networks within Michigan. And then sometimes what you see from that is, even despite the good supports you try to set up locally, sometimes folks do that secondary migration where they might move to another state, sometimes attracted by places that have larger communities. But for folks that stay, we try to do the wraparound whole community support. So if it's a smaller nation in Africa, we might try to connect them with another African community organization. It's not the same, and we know that, but sometimes that little bit of familiarity can go a long way. And then, of course, the folks in the schools and non-immigrant communities that can provide a supportive base and, lend a friendly ear. Those are helpful supports as well.
Thank you, Christine. I'm not seeing anybody go off mute, and my temptation is we happen to have one of our partners from Comunalia, Pamela Cruz, and Comunalia in Mexico has done grant making sub-grants to a number of its members, including the case I mentioned in the city of Tijuana with the Fundación Internacional de la Comunidad, who did extensive interviews with those migrant populations. And Pamela, if you'd like to just share a few thoughts about what they found and what that work was like, because it was very powerful to hear that presentation during the webinar that we did together.
Thank you, Michael. Well, I'm not expert on the topic because, as you mentioned, FIC was the one who did the whole like research on the migrants and especially children and women in Tijuana. But what they wrote in the report on vital signs, using the methodology from the Community Foundations of Canada, they found that most of the women who are in Tijuana right now are mainly running away from violence, like domestic violence, and most of them are from Central America. Most of the kids or the children in this case, was interesting to learn the perspective of children, because mostly the adults are the ones who make the decision to flee the country, and they don't get the chance to give their perspective or feelings of how they are embracing all the situations and challenges that they face during the migration process. So, for instance, what I know from the Community Foundation in Tijuana is that they are working towards helping these children to feel more at home, like to feel more welcome in Tijuana, because Tijuana faces different, very complex challenges. As in Mexico, we are facing different challenges in insecurity and human rights violations, mostly for people who are fleeing conflict in Central America. And even people from within Mexico are being displaced inside the country. So some women who actually lived in the south center of Mexico are trying to reach out to the US. So they get stuck in Tijuana. So the challenge that Tijuana is facing right now is how can we welcome these communities, how we can make the city of Tijuana a safer place for these people who are kind of in this situation of like trying to see if they stay in Tijuana or they move towards the US or go back even to their home country. So right now, what I know is that they're working with children as helping them to kind of like level up in education, so they can start going to school in Tijuana, but also trying to also help the women and families to find a way to get an income. So that's kind of like the situation, what I have heard from the Community Foundation of Tijuana. But yeah, it's very complex and it's very interesting. And for me, the most important part of this research that they did is that they chose to also hear the voices of the children. So they want to be heard about the decisions that the family make, and also how the mental health situation that they are facing is also very important to take into account, so they can feel more welcome in the communities that they land in this case.
And there's kind of a nice symmetry here that I want to recognize, in that we started off this series with the webinar in Spanish with Comunalia and these 3 case studies. And it seems kind of fitting that we start to end up the series with Pamela and sharing that reflection. And Pamela, I'm going to ask you a favor to put the website of Comunalia in the chat for us. There are reports in Spanish of the Fundación Internacional de la Comunidad from Tijuana and 2 other organizations that were funded from Punta de Mita and from the state of Morelos, La Fundación Comunidad, that are just fascinating. And interestingly, they use the Canadian vital signs framework to talk about having vital conversations to talk about the SDGs as an entry point. And that's another central theme throughout these. And in the case of Central Florida, the crosswalk was between social determinants of health and the SDGs. As here, it's been the welcoming standard and the SDGs. And that idea that Larry's talked about being a Trojan horse, just an entry point. So in the time that we have left, I wanted to ask each of our panelists if they had a thought, a reflection, a piece of advice. If there's one thing you could do as a member of a community foundation, as a member of a community, a member of government, one thing you could do to help create a more welcoming community, a step forward for various actors, if you could offer a word of advice, a thought, a reflection, And to see if the people that are tuned in and the participants in our webinar, if they could share those ideas, something that you're going to take away from these important experiences that we've heard about today, and share that in the chat. I'm just going to go down the row according to the order that happens to be on my Zoom screen, because obviously I'm a servant to Zoom. I'm going to start with Surabhi first.
Thanks. So I think, and I kind of alluded to this before, but a lot of the very grassroots organizations who don't have access to philanthropy or philanthropic, money, I feel like a lot of those can be neighborhood-based groups that are working to promote welcoming communities and just aren't organized in a way that is conducive to foundation grant making. And so if there was something that I could do, it's just, I don't know, rip up the guidelines and figure out something else, but to create more equitable paths to distribution, whether that's, I know a lot of for different projects work with intermediaries, or, figure out other mechanisms to ensure that resources can be shared with the groups that might not need, tons of resources, but some amount of support could help build neighborhood engagement and a sense of belonging on a more micro level. I think that the macro stuff we talked about, but there is a lot of neighborhood-based work that, of course, is happening already, but that we could be funding.
Thanks so much, Surabhi. So scale down. Make it simpler for folks to enter. Christine, you're next on my screen. Please go ahead.
Yeah, well, at Merck, we have a long policy wish list at the federal level, but I'll save the long list for another time, or can share that with you offline. We have, some big goals about kind of overhauling the immigration system and the asylum system. At the moment, there's a real opportunity for the Afghan Adjustment Act. So we encourage everyone to contact their congressperson and help pass that, because this is a real moment for that. I would say, to boil it down locally, though, get connected. That's something we're always striving to do better. And to Surabhi's point, we are actually one of the larger organizations. And so we're always trying to partner with smaller immigrant-led grassroots groups, take cues from them, so offer resources that we have to support their work, partner on projects. And so anyone who's interested in this, I've always said the beauty of welcoming work is that anyone can get involved and have a role to play. So whether you're an educator or work at a nonprofit or a healthcare organization, there are things that folks can do. And part of it is just starting by getting connected to who's in your community already. So connecting to those grassroots leaders, sometimes they don't even have a group yet. And it's just connecting to those neighborhood leaders. Or sometimes there's a champion or advocate in the municipal government, and sometimes they work in building services. They're not, they may not have a lot of other services under their power, but there's a champion that you can start with, and just start getting connected and build from there. And hopefully as those grow bigger, maintaining the cross-sector aspect is really key, so that as you grow, you can make sure you're touching different aspects of the community.
Thank you for that, Christine. The idea of reaching out, connecting. Not being overly ambitious to start off with, but just making simple, straightforward connections to advance the work. Thank you. And now, in setting up Daniel, who's next on my screen, I saw a question from one of our wonderful colleagues here in Grand Rapids, from Tara Carnahan, who directs a group called Treetops Collective that works on welcoming strategies for new Americans, especially women and girls. And they've emphasized entrepreneurialism. And I think Surabhi's been engaged in that work some, and Daniel's teeing up a program related to that. So I'd really like to prime you, Daniel. I don't know if you're going to talk about that in your closing thoughts, but if I could add that as a second thought, if it wasn't your first one, please.
Yeah, so I also just wanted, I think someone asked a question about whether or not certification applied just to city or county governments or organizations. And so the certified, the standard itself, the document can be used and has been used by organizations and other institutions to really help them think about what are the kinds of things that make communities more welcoming and the kinds of programs and infrastructure that would be needed at the local level, and sort of helps them organize their work. The certification program, the Certified Welcoming Program, is specifically for city and county governments in the United States. And I'm happy to connect with folks later on if they have more questions around that. But yeah, so one of the things that we are that we do at Welcoming America, we have a number of different initiatives and programs. One of them is called Gateways for Growth, which is an opportunity for municipal governments or chambers of commerce to apply for this technical assistance and matching grant program that allows communities to receive sort of a research brief on the economic impact of newcomers in their local communities, as well as technical assistance to develop a strategic plan around welcoming and inclusion. And we provide that support, ongoing support for a year. This year, because we are expanding our work with community foundations and really thinking about the role that community foundations can similarly play to local governments and to chambers of commerce in bringing together multi-sector collaboratives and really being leaders and pushing forward some of these local efforts. We've expanded Gateways for Growth to include community foundations in the United States. So if you're a community foundation and you've been thinking about this work, Gateways for Growth is a great opportunity for you all to really think about applying for and really starting to think about how to bring together this multi-sector collaborative. If you go to Welcoming America's website, you'll see that, and we'll share out some of the links as well for Gateways for Growth. But there's a informational webinar that we're going to have on September 20th. I will be hosting office hours on the 21st for community foundations to do some one-on-one conversations about this program. And so I encourage folks who are interested to learn more about it. And Mandy just put the link in there that has all of the information about the deadlines and some of the information sessions that we're going to have around that. And that's it for me.
Thanks so much, Daniel. And Larry, I'm going to give you the penultimate word. Piece of advice, encouragement for our participants to make communities more welcoming.
I don't have any deeper wisdom than what you've already heard. So what I'll do is simply underscore what's been said before by quoting E.M. Forster, the English novelist, who said, "Only connect, live in fragments no more." That, I think, is the underlying impetus behind the advancing welcoming work that we've been doing, is simply to find ways to make meaningful connections between the work of community foundations and Welcoming America and other organizations, obviously, that are doing this work, many of whom are represented in the Welcoming America network. So I would simply underscore the opportunity that webinars like this, create to make connections and especially try to, ensure that if you, have the opportunity to build stronger connections. The whole key is thinking in terms of sustainability of these networks in the long run. So pay attention to connections, make sure they're solid and strong, and do what you can to improve them.
Thanks so very much.
Michael, before I forget, I just wanted to mention about Welcoming Week. It's happening September 9th through the 18th, and I hope that folks can go to welcomingweek.org and learn more about the campaign and connect with us on that.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Daniel, for saying that. In the chat, there's a couple of other links to the TFR, the Foundation Review Special Issue. There's a deeper dive coming up at the Kansas Association of Community Foundation event in October, where Daniel and a number of other folks are going to be on a panel to talk about these issues and their connection to community foundations. We've shared links to the Welcoming Standard, to Welcoming Week. I owe a profound debt of gratitude to everybody that's on the screen now as well as my, and there are the emails that we promised. Those of you that persevered and stayed to the end, that's your prize for that. And I want to really acknowledge my colleague, Mandy Sharp, who's made this possible. So thanks to Mandy, thanks to Emily, all my friends here at the Johnson Center for their support, and to our panelists and to all the panelists that have contributed to this conversation over the summer, our friends at Communalia who dove in and took it upon themselves to provide simultaneous interpretation. Thanks so much. My apologies for folks that asked questions and had observations I didn't lift up for lack of time rather than lack of goodwill towards you all. So thanks very much. Appreciate your time today, and we'll be in touch. Please connect with us. Look forward to seeing you all again somewhere, someplace. Take care.
Thank you.